when we look at all of these things together, effective arguments do one thing. They achieve what we call exigence or purpose. They leverage ethos, pathos, and logos, which we will talk about later. But they take all of these things into account: assumptions, audience analysis, the way they choose their words, their syntax, the use of their style and academic tone to really drive home the point they want to make it effective, to make it useful, to leverage what they know and what they know about the resources, evidence, and logic to really drive that point home and to make a difference or to make an impact or to create a call to action, if you will, for some of the writing. And so exigence means achieving purpose. Does this argument achieve the purpose it was intended to make? And that can be determined by the thesis statement. When we read a thesis statement, we know the exact claim. We know what's being argued. And after reading the paper and looking at the evidence and the sources, we can then ask ourselves as an audience member, does that particular author achieve exigence or purpose? Exigence is a very important word. Make sure you write it down. Conversely, ineffective arguments clearly pose the opposite, right? They do not make a claim that is something that's academic or that someone would disagree with. For instance, smoking is bad for you. We know this. This is something that's overdone, right? We know that it's factual. It's a factual assumption. We know that data supports that smoking is bad. So that's not something that's going to lend to a credible argument or credible research, right? An ineffective argument that also involves support and claims being non-existent. So all of the sub-points, the sub-main points, A, B, and C, and all of the evidence that you bring in is non-existent. There's no support for the argument that's being made. There's no data. There's no actual logic or reasoning based evidence that's brought into the argument to support that original claim. Also, the support's not logical. An example here, global warming does not exist because it snowed in Arizona last winter. Well, clearly here they're taking in a completely abnormal situation to represent what would be normality in the context of their argument. It's not logical. It doesn't make sense. The evidence is unreliable. So another example here is using material from a corporation's website to praise or to defend the company. So when you pull in evidence that's biased, that's clearly super closely associated with the topic or has some type of invested or vested interest in that topic or subject, it would be something that's unreliable, right? We can't trust that. We can't trust CNN to defend their position on something that's been scrutinized, that's data-driven, when they release someone from a news reporter position that it's been proven, right, through criminal evidence. So that's an example of evidence being unreliable. Oftentimes, just like with unacademic types of papers, the topic or ideas are too broad. It can't be proven in the amount of space given. It's difficult to bring new perspectives into the ongoing discussion. And so that's what's important about assumptions, because we have to make assumptions or starting points for our arguments that are doable, that are manageable for the type of argument we're going to make. So if you were tasked with writing 3 or 4 pages of a research paper, we have to make assumptions based on our audience that would be sufficient enough for us to bring in evidence that would support our claim for 3 to 4 pages. Here is the other part. Modes of persuasion. This is probably the most important part of rhetoric and argumentation. The appeals of persuasion. Aristotle in 384-322 BCE, he's the most notable product of the educational program devised by Plato, a seminal thinker, mathematician, and thinker of Alexander the Great of ancient Greece. 2,000 years ago, he was the author of The Art of Rhetoric. We often refer to this as just simply rhetoric or on persuasion and communication. This work introduced the idea of how we make arguments and how we make them effectively and how do we analyze if an argument is effective, if at all. And it's based on 3 basic steps, 3 basic elements. We call this modes of persuasion appeals, persuasion appeals. You'll hear it called several different things, but when you hear ethos, pathos, and logos, these are the three main aspects of whether or not an argument is effective. And I'll tell you why. We oftentimes hear the word rhetoric and think it's something that's suspended in the ether. It's so far beyond anything we can comprehend. But rhetoric simply means it's the art of arguing. Is an argument successful or not? Is the rhetoric successful or not? Is the discourse successful or not? It's not something that's overly complicated. It just means, is the argument successful? Does it achieve exigence or purpose? Why or why not? And then what is persuasion? This is a quote from the source I just mentioned that's extremely important, and it kind of encapsulates the three main ideas. Of the modes of persuasion furnished by the spoken word, we can say this in written word also, there are three kinds. Persuasion is achieved by the speaker's personal character, when the speech was so spoken as to make us think him credible. Secondly, persuasion may come through hearers, audience, when the speech stirs their emotions or pulls at their heartstrings. Thirdly, persuasion or argumentation is affected through the speech itself when we have proved a truth or an apparent truth by means of persuasive arguments suitable to the case in question, or we've organized our points in such a way that it proves our claim for us. In other words, logic. The three modes of persuasion are as follows: ethos, pathos, and logos. These are crucially important. These three items determine how you choose the sources for your papers, how people determine the credibility of your own research or papers or academic work. Everything that has to do with academic conversation and how we evaluate research or analysis or data has to do with these three things. This is how we evaluate it. Ethos refers to character and integrity, or credibility, if you will. When we ask, are the modes of persuasion in terms of ethos or the ethos appeals strong, we would ask, are the aspects of credibility in this work strong? And we'll go through a specific list for this in a moment. Pathos refers to emotions. This is all Greek, by the way. Ethos refers to credibility in Greek. Pathos refers to emotion in Greek. Pathos refers to emotions, or words too emotionally charged, or ideas or assumptions so emotionally charged that there's a clear bias present that's going to be a flaw in the argument when it's presented to the audience. So that's something that's very important. Logos refers to logic, relevance, and rationale, or the ideas presented logically, are all of the details necessary to understand a phenomenon or situation present for the audience to be able to understand sufficiently the argument you're making. Is the rationale or the conclusion or the working from the if statement to the then statement present? And if it's not, then the appeals to logos fail. But anyway, these are the three main pillars: ethos, pathos, and logos. This is oftentimes drawn as a triangle. I will post a picture of this on Canvas, but usually you see an equilateral triangle where there's ethos, pathos, and logos as the three different angles of the triangle. And what's important is when we are writing research or when we're evaluating research, if emotionally laden appeals are too broad, then that angle widens, which means that the triangle is thrown off. It's no longer equal. The same way for logic. If there is less logic than what should be there, less organization or less detail, then that angle shortens itself somewhat and throws off the equilateral nature of the triangle. And so it's a very balanced approach. The idea is if we want to achieve exigence or true purpose with our argument, we want to aim for an equilateral triangle when it comes to ethos, pathos, and logos. We need to effectively understand our audience, purpose and context, and be able to produce content, assumptions, claims, and theses that would create an equilateral triangle when it comes to ethos, pathos, and logos, so that they're balanced based on the situation, so that they're balanced based on the audience. So let's look at these and what they mean. Let's look at ethos a little bit more in depth. When we ask questions about ethos or credibility, trust, reliability, right? Should we trust this source? Is it credible? We ask these questions. How knowledgeable is the author about the topic? Is the author confident, using an authoritative or assertive tone? Is the author using reliable sources or evidence? Has the author cited his or her sources accurately, using the correct style, if you will? Is the author recognizing or respecting opposing points of view? Is the author using other modes of appeal other than just data? And has the author proofread their work? Credibility. Ethos means credibility. If you receive a paper that is laden with grammatical or spelling errors, you're not going to trust that person to be a professional, right? If the person is not pulling in sources that are actual, credible, reliable sources that data can back up, then those sources are not trustworthy, right? So that is immediately diminishing ethos for that author. If the author is not citing sources or adhering to the right writing style, they clearly don't care enough about the idea they're trying to present in the academic community to get it across effectively. And so just by not citing sources correctly or adhering to APA or MLA or whatever the case may be, then their argument's automatically diminished in terms of credibility. Is the author understanding the scope of the topic or what's being argued so much so to be able to rebuttal any opposing points of view? If not, that's an issue. And then, is the author using other modes of appeal? Are they using emotional appeals? Are they using logic? Again, it's a balance. You need all three of these things in order to present an effective argument. In terms of academic writing, is the writer proofreading their work? I already mentioned this, but any type of written work that does not adhere to the right style, hence APA, any writing that does not eliminate personal words, pronouns, attitudes, opinions, beliefs, any writing that's not objective, any writing that it does not remove the conversational elements would be less credible. Someone would be less likely to believe the work that you're presenting as being factual, truthful work. That's what's important about ethos. There are several ways we can determine whether an ethos appeal to persuasion or persuasion is effective. We can ask about credentials. Are sources that are being integrated provided by professionals in the field, doctors, scientists, licensed credentialed practitioners of that particular field, really professionals in that area. There's also subtle ways: appearance, tone, error-free, grammar-free prose, conducting an audience analysis to determine if the tone, appearance, approach is relevant to the audience. So we can also, not only by identifying whether or not that the tone is authoritative or assertive, that it's grammar-free, that sources are actual, relevant, credible sources that's bringing them into the argument to support the idea or the claim. If the author does not conduct an audience analysis to determine if the approach to how they present their argument is effective, then that's going to be diminishing their appeal to ethos. Their ethos is going to be minimized in that way. Here's an example of ethos. Raghu Murtagude is executive director of the Chesapeake Bay Forecasting System at the University of Maryland Earth Science System Interdisciplinary Center and a professor in the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Science. This is an example of credentialing, using professional credentialing to bolster appeals to ethos, or in other words, to show that the source we are integrating is from a professional in the field by showing how they are a professional in that field. Pathos.